Good morning, everyone. Great to be here back in London. It's a little bit safer here than back at home right now. Back in 2018, I left a very safe 24-year career in banking to join a revolution. What I saw going on in the automotive market in China was a once-in-a-generation shift. And when I had the opportunity to join one of the leading players, WM, I leapt at it. I'd love to talk a bit more about WM, but I'm going to save that for the end of the presentation. What I wanted to do in the first part is explain to you what's happened in China, why it's happened, and the key objectives behind it. So the Chinese auto market is a big beast. Last year, 22 million cars were sold there. That's 10 million more than in the whole of the EU. And at penetration levels of 176 cars per 1,000 of population, this market's only going to get bigger. Right now, 60% of the world's electric cars and 99% of the world's electric buses are on the roads in China. Last year, in 2019, 1.2 million cars with a plug were sold there. That's 5% of the overall market. Looking forward, even taking the most conservative penetration estimates, you're looking, in all likelihood, at an EV sales market of 5 million units by 2025. To put that in perspective, that's more than 2 times the total number of cars that were sold here in the UK last year. Let's look at why. I can think of 3 key reasons. The first one is energy security. China, as the world's largest energy consumer, has a bit of a problem. It imports 72% of its annual crude requirements. The problem gets worse. Most of that oil has to transit through the Straits of Hormuz and the Straits of Malacca. That is pretty problematic for China's central planners. Ground transportation accounts for nearly a quarter of that oil consumption. The low-hanging fruit here for China is, in terms of reducing its oil consumption, is to change the powertrain. Next comes the climate and air quality. China's Paris commitment was to reduce the carbon intensity of its economy by 60% by 2030. 13% of China's CO2 footprint comes from cars. And then we come to air. 3 years ago, the WHO conducted a survey in which they estimated that in China, an additional 1.1 million people died prematurely each year in China because of bad air. Human cost aside, the economic cost of that is staggering. We estimate that that's about $38 billion per year of hit to China's GDP. Back in 2013, regularly the air in Beijing contained at least 40 times greater than deemed safe levels of NOx and SOx emissions. That number's already reduced by 30%, but there's a lot of work to be done. In the eyes of the authorities, the concerns of mothers of asthmatic toddlers in Beijing and carers of elderly with emphysema in Shanghai are critical to maintaining social fabric in China, and so it's a critical focus for the authorities. Next, we have industrial strategy. As we all know, China is really, really good at making things. In fact, it's probably got the most efficient manufacturing economy on the planet. Just ask Tim Cook at Apple how he would feel about making 300 million iPhones a year in the continental USA. China's been in the automotive industry now for just under 30 years, but the auto industry is over 130 years old. The trouble is, China's been playing catch-up and it's been trying to play catch-up on that missing century. And really, in terms of the internal combustion engine, it never really caught up with the technology. So early, they decided that they were going to take a leapfrog approach. You know, what you had with China before this was an industry that was big, but it wasn't strong, a bit like this red flag limousine from FAW. Next, a little bit of a history lesson. Now, I really don't want the Tesla fanboys out there to at me about this, but it's this guy that probably had the biggest single impact on the electrification of the car industry globally. No, he doesn't have 30 million followers on Twitter, and he's certainly not a household name. His name is Wan Gang. Back in the early 2000s, Wan was an engineer in an Audi plant in Germany when a visiting delegation from China, which included the then Minister of Science and Technology, visited the factory. And he was talent spotted. Less than 10 years later, Wan held that same ministerial post. I mean, that is a position of extreme seniority for someone that wasn't even a member of the Chinese Communist Party. It was his white paper on new energy vehicles in the early 2000s that really catalyzed the electric vehicle boom in China and triggered billions of dollars of capex and investment support. Now, I want to apologize for the quality of this photo. It's the only one that I actually took myself, and I took it out of a hotel bedroom window in Shanghai last year. The reason I like this photo is I think it captures in one single image a national transportation strategy. So what you've got here is you've got the EV charging bays in the foreground there, short walking distance to Shanghai's largest high-speed rail station, and in the distance you've got the domestic terminal of the Hongqiao Airport, Shanghai's second airport. You know, the critical thing is here is joined up thinking takes cars off the road. So why do I want to talk about trains? Back in 2008, the first high-speed rail line between Beijing and Tianjin was opened, cutting journey times from 2 hours to 30 minutes. Over the next 10 years, 30,000 kilometers of high-speed rail line was laid down. That makes it now 65% of the world's total of high-speed rail line. It doesn't end there. By 2025, China expects to open another 10,000 kilometers of high-speed rail network, which will then connect 80% of China's major cities. It kind of puts HS2 in perspective. On busy days, 7.6 million people are transferred between China's big cities at over 350 kilometers an hour. So what the central planners have done here is effectively changed the use case for the passenger car. No one I know or work with in China would dream of using their car for an intercity journey. To be fair, the road trip or Route 66 culture never really existed in China. And for the pedants out there, I know that Monument Valley isn't on Route 66. But the reality is, for the 99.9% use case of car usage in China, the picture on the right is more applicable. Moving pretty slowly in an urban setting in heavy traffic. So why does that matter? The planners have identified that this narrow use case for cars is a big deal in terms of electrification. It means that big ranges are not necessarily required, and while lithium batteries are still relatively expensive on a kilowatt per hour basis, we can supply vehicles with smaller battery packs that are more affordable for the consumer. In fact, the mass market of electric vehicles in China contain battery packs of less than 50 kilowatt hours, which is about 30 or 40% smaller from what you see on the lower range Teslas, the Jaguar I-Paces, and the Audi e-trons. The next big barrier to EV adoption is obviously charging infrastructure. Again, changing the use case has an impact here. EV infrastructure is expensive, and what changing the use case does is allows the authorities to concentrate the investment in charging infrastructure in the areas where 80% of the EVs that have been sold to date are, i.e. the major megacities in eastern China. Yes, State Grid has installed a charging network on the highway system, so there are DC chargers everywhere. But it's more importantly in the big cities where charging stations are literally everywhere. In fact, China has more than twice the number of charging stations than the rest of the world put together right now. Range anxiety is not a big thing in China. Right, we've talked about the carrots in terms of billions of dollars of investment in subsidies and in infrastructure. Let's talk about the stick, policy and regulation. I guess the most visible of these regulations is China's green plate policy. This very much varies from city to city. In Beijing, your chance of getting a license plate increases tenfold if you're applying for a green NEV plate. In Shanghai, you don't have to enter the lottery at all, and in fact, you avoid a bill of over $11,000 to acquire your blue fossil plate. For the overall industry, we have the dual credit policy, which is essentially very similar to the fleet emission quota policies that you see here in the European Union. The implication of that is any global OEM that wants to have a meaningful business in China has got to have an all-in strategy for electrification in China. Next, I want to talk about the supply chain a bit. For most of the history of the internal combustion engine, nearly 100% of the core intellectual property has existed for internal combustion engines has existed outside of China. And this did the industry in China absolutely no favors. And China was not going to make the same mistake again. So we, WM, as a company operating in a core made in China 2025 industry, our entire supply chain is sited within China's shores. This is an image of the skateboard of our first vehicle platform model in the Ajax platform on the EX5 SUV. Let's talk about that big bit in the middle, the battery. Back in 2013, China surpassed South Korea as the largest manufacturer of lithium batteries in the world. China now controls between 50 and 70% of global raw materials for lithium-ion batteries. And in terms of manufacturing capacity, we're on track now to have 400 gigawatts of capacity by 2023. That's enough to power 13 million standard-size electric vehicles. Okay. I want to address the elephant in the room. I want to talk about coal cars. Coal cars is a criticism leveled at the EV industry, pretty successfully, a message that has been conveyed to us frankly, by the energy lobby. Yes, China's electric cars are powered by a grid which is heavily dependent on coal-fired power stations. It's true. However, I want to put this in perspective. Firstly, China's coal fleet is amongst the newest on the planet, and in terms of efficiency, far, far greener than most of what we're used to in the West. And you think about it, in the United States, some of the coal-fired power plants are nearly 60 years old. Secondly, in terms of renewables, China is more than pulling its weight. According to IEA stats, in the last 3 years, China accounts for over 45% of global investment in renewable power projects, and that number is growing at 30% plus per annum. And the EV story plays 100% into this renewables idea. We at WM already have joint ventures in place with the state grid to ensure that our cars share the load of grid load capacity. In terms of offtake and second life, we already have offtake agreements with a number of renewable power suppliers to ensure that our battery packs have a 20-year second life in the form of static storage for solar farms and for wind farms. Next, I want to talk about our customers. This is a still from one of our social media adverts for the launch of our EX6 model last year in November. Whilst EV skepticism is very much commonplace in the West, the fact of the matter is, in China, the attitudes are completely different. There isn't a fossil fuel nostalgia to contend with. In terms of the priorities that consumers are thinking about when they're thinking about their next car purchase, 0 to 60 acceleration dynamics, brand status actually play a very limited role. You know, in fact, if you look at where consumer adoption and consumer acceptance is right now, there have been recent studies. OC&C did a study last year that said that 71% of Chinese car buyers were likely or were definitely going to buy an EV next time round. What's much more important to the to the car buyer of today, you know, there might be certain older consumers for whom the status of owning an imported S-Class is a big deal. For the modern car buyer, the two things that are critically important, these consumers are aggressive adopters of homegrown technology, and they want the car to be a natural extension of their hyper-connected lifestyle. In fact, in a recent survey by McKinsey, over 60% of Chinese car buyers said that they would switch car brands on the basis of connectivity features alone. So what are we offering these car buyers? This is our debut model, which we launched in 2018, just over 20,000 units of this car on the road. It's offered in 2 range variants, 400 kilometers and 520 kilometers. And it's on the road for 139,000 RMB after subsidies, which is around 20,000 US dollars. Last November, we launched the EX6. This is a larger form factor SUV. Think about the same size as a BMW X3. This is the fully spec'd Founders Edition of the EX6. Comes on the road at 239,000 RMB, which is about 34,000 US dollars. And that model is fully equipped with level 2 ADAS, Napa seats, and all of the interior features that I'll profile now. So we've built our business around 3 core technologies. Living Engine is what we call our operating system, our vehicle operating system. It's driven by that LCD panel, by facial recognition, and by our AI voice assistant called Xiaowei. Living Motion is what we call our investments in the electric powertrain. The BMS technology and the battery packing technology is proprietary to WM. Living Pilot is our investments in driver assistance and in autonomous features. All models from WM Motor from next year will incorporate a full suite of sensors and technology that enable level 3 capability. I'll finish on a little ad. This was the launch ad from the EX6 last November. Give you an introduction to a few of the features. Xiaowei, our natural language voice instruction. This guy is activating the navigation system of the car simply by saying, "I'm going to play basketball." Streaming services inside the car naturally synced to your streaming at home. In-car mood modes. This one's romance mode. It's very Barry White. This augmented reality system is more than just a gimmick. What it does is it also drives the hands and pedal-free automated parking assistant. This lady is activating the Internet of Things capability. 1 word to the voice assistant and she's switching on the aircon at home. Facial recognition cameras picks up driver fatigue in this user. This guy says simply, "I need to get a charge." The navigation system takes over and immediately navigates him to the nearest charging station. Listen, I'd love to go on for the rest of the afternoon, but sadly we're out of time. Thanks very much for listening.